There is no better time to visit BMW of Morristown, your BMW Center of Excellence. Come experience what truly separates the original sports sedan from the rest when you take a test drive at the BMW 40 Years of an Icon sales event. For a limited time, you can lease the legendary 2015 BMW 328i X-Drive sedan for $299 per month. Learn more online at morristownbmw.com. Lease is 36 months with $39.95 down. Tax, title, registration, and dealer fees additional. Includes $1,000 anniversary credit. Expires 5/31/15.
Blog Talk Radio.
Good afternoon. Chuck Moore Speaks, Monday through Friday, 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And this is your host, Chuck Morse, emanating from Boston, Massachusetts. Welcome aboard our listeners at Cyberstation USA Radio Network, WWPR AM in Tampa Bay, Florida, KSKQ FM in Ashland, Oregon, and, of course, Blog Talk Radio. Program announcement starting March 1st. The program will be nationally syndicated by the IRN USA Radio Network and will change time to 10 to noon, Monday through Friday, Eastern Standard Time. My guest is Harry Veryser. He served as director of the graduate program in economics at the University of Detroit Mercy and chairman of the Walsh College Department of Economics and Finance. Harry is the author of a new book. He considers himself an Austrian economist, very much in the tradition of Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek. The book is, I'm looking it up, entitled "It Didn't Have to Be This Way, Why Boom and Bust is Unnecessary, and How the Austrian School of Economics Breaks the Cycle." Harry, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Oh, Chuck, thank you very much for having me.
Give us, my listeners, a quick thumbnail sketch with regard to the Austrian School of Economics.
Well, the school was actually founded in 1871 by Karl Menger, and Menger himself received a doctorate in economics from Jagiellonian University in Poland, and then went on to be a reporter on the Vienna stock and commodity exchanges. And what he discovered on those exchanges was that the standard economic theory at the time did not really explain what was happening. And so he wrote a book, Principles of Economics, in which he set forth the whole idea of economics and price theory. Menger then founded the school, and it was actually based upon not aggregates like most mainstream economics is today, GNP and et cetera, but actually watching what individual actors did on markets with response to scarcity.
Go ahead. Sorry. I mean, it seems to me, if I can synopsize, that the Austrian economics school might be comparable to what we today call the libertarian point of view in the United States, perhaps as articulated by authors such as Ayn Rand, Murray Rothbard, maybe Milton Friedman. Not that he was to economy, but the idea being that the free market is overall, that basically free trade, free market, free enterprise will stabilize economies in all nations.
Well, I'll tell you this: the libertarians use the Austrian school because it's compatible with them, but not all Austrians are strict libertarians.
Right.
So, for example, now Friedman does agree with the Austrians on free markets, but the monetary policy of Friedman and the Austrians is entirely different. Friedman never did accept the Austrian theory of the trade cycle, did not understand that once you start inflating the currency or inflating credit, it distorts or warps the economy in such a way that brings about the downturn. Ayn Rand did not quite understand the Austrians because her entire thesis was there's this small group of very brilliant people who run the world. The Austrians would tend to reject that and to say that each person has their own unique contribution to the division of labor, and the Austrian theory stresses cooperation far more than this elite that runs things.
Okay, my guest is Harry Veryser. We're talking Austrian economics and its influence or its prescription, if you will, for
Sure.
the boom and bust cycle. I mean, Harry, how does Austrian economics relate to national economic policies, such as in the United States, issues of trade tariffs, of in a sense, the government giving extra protection to domestic industry versus exports into the country, which might tend to dump products onto the market? Do they believe that a national sovereign state has a right to set those sorts of economic policies, and are those a good idea?
Well, they would say national sovereign states are going to do it because they have the power, but the question is the prudence of doing such things. And I have to tell you, for some years I was in the metal stamping business before I wrote the book. And the steel tariff actually ruined most metal stampers and most metal fabricators in Detroit and throughout the Midwest. So the question here becomes the prudence of it. The Austrians would argue that in most cases, government intervention in the economy creates more problems than it actually solves. I'm from a city, Detroit, Michigan, and one of our biggest problems here has been government intervention. From the time I was a young collegian, I watched government program after government program come into Detroit, and it has absolutely destroyed the place. So we would argue from a prudential standpoint that before government intervenes in any economy, it has to really look at the long-term consequences. Hence, Henry Hazlitt, a member of the school, said in his book Economics in One Lesson, a good economist looks at the effect of every government intervention on the long-term consequences. The Austrians tend to look at what government should do is set the basis, protect property, protect contract, encourage families, encourage free markets, encourage entrepreneurship, and then allow the economy to develop. So we tend to say, let's do the baseline, the foundational stuff first, let the economy develop, and we'll get the most efficient use of our resources.
Harry, when you talk about government intervention, for example, in your hometown of Detroit, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that what you're referring to would be these big kind of nanny state interference programs that were creating bad regulation for business, were creating unfunded mandates for businesses that drove businesses out of the city. And at the same time, though, I think that open borders and complete free trade without any protection for America's big industry also hurt Detroit with regard to, for example, the automobile industry and perhaps other industries where for example, the NAFTA agreement and GATT, which took the ability of Congress to regulate tariff and trade, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 4, into this international agency of unelected bureaucrats. What it did was result in a flight of these businesses over the border into both Canada and Mexico and elsewhere. So, I think that you're in my opinion, you're half right with regard to onerous government regulation of business. I think we should have free enterprise in this country, and we should let business do what it does best, which is business. But at the same time, there's always been a national economic policy as subscribed by the Constitution, which allows the federal government to regulate tariff and trade. It allows the government to give domestic business a certain advantage over imports, and that those things are to be adjusted. It's not necessarily good that there'd be high tariffs, but at times there's an appropriate need to protect American industry and keep American capital inside the country. No?
Yes, I agree. I agree with you on that to the extent that that is. But I would tell you this: as a businessman, what we face is an enormous amount of regulation. And once government comes in and government starts regulating things, all of a sudden you're starting to add cost. For example, the national, the Small Business Administration estimates that there's $10,000 worth of regulations per every employee. And when you have a small business or any business, if you have $1 worth of regulations, you're going to have to go out and you're going to have to sell a multiple of that to make up for that regulatory cost. So that'd be one thing. But the other thing I would point out to you is this, Chuck, is that remember the largest time of prosperity in this country was during the time of the Bretton Woods Agreement, and that was from 1946 to 1971. The United States was on top of the world. At that time, you had GATT, you had a relatively free trade area, and the important thing is you had a gold standard that disciplined the monetary affairs. And what's happened now is that if you take a look at where the United States started to lose, if you go right back to 71, the breaking of the gold standard, that's when we started running tremendous deficits in our balance of trade. So I would argue on this standpoint that one of the problems we've had is the indiscipline of the money supply, the expansion of the money supply, which has put American business at a disadvantage. I'd go back and say this about the freer trade, is that NAFTA is not free trade. NAFTA is managed trade. Most businesses can't participate in it because of the bureaucratic requirements of NAFTA. So in a sense, I was opposed to NAFTA. A lot of the Austrians were opposed to NAFTA. Ron Paul was in Congress. He voted against NAFTA because of the fact that it's not really free trade, it's managed trade. And I think that people and yourself have a leg to stand on. You certainly have certainly a good criticism of NAFTA, which I probably would agree with a good deal of your criticism.
Well, first of all, NAFTA and GATT were not approved by Congress until 1993, even though it was part of the Bretton Woods Agreement. It was the third spoke in the wheel. The first two spokes were the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Both of them were approved in the late 1940s. And then I think that after the approval of GATT in 1993, it was signed into law by Bill Clinton and supported by former President George H.W. Bush. That's when you saw what I think you could describe as a growing trade imbalance. But you talk about another issue I'd like to bring up as well, which is the monetary question. 1970, Nixon took the American dollar off the gold standard, and since then it has been floating internationally, still remains the standard in which other currencies value are pegged. But you guys are supporters of a return to the gold standard, and more specifically, I'd like to know your position with regard to our entire currency system as it stands under the Federal Reserve.
Sure. Okay, let me just mention one thing, Chuck, that you said. While GATT may not have been approved to 1993, Harry Truman, under the Truman administration, lowered tariffs significantly. Remember that we were under the regime of Smoot-Hawley up until 1946, right. And Truman slashed tariffs significantly. It went from something like an average of 40%, 50% tariffs down to 15%. Then Eisenhower lowered it further. Kennedy lowered it further. So during that period of time, even though they were not on GATT, there was a significant lowering of tariff barriers. Number two, let's get on the Federal Reserve system for a bit, and the inflation that was introduced during the period of Bretton Woods. Inflation, you can actually check this out by going to the Bureau of Labor Statistics inflation indicator. The value of the dollar fell about 50% during those 25 years. So what was a dollar, say, in 1947 was $2 by 1971. Yep. However, after the collapse of GATT, after the collapse of and the ending of Bretton Woods, the dollar went from in 1971, the next 25 years, it fell by a factor of 4. In other words, what was a dollar in 1971 was $4 by 1996, and today it's approaching $6. So you're having a problem with the inflation that is really becoming a major factor. It's slow, so most people don't see it. It's gradual. Although if you take a look at your gas, your petrol,
Yeah,
and
sure.
food prices, you can see them moving up.
The dollar's worth a dime compared to what it was worth in the 1930s, which is why gold itself is seen as a good investment. And by the way, I'm not necessarily against low tariffs. I just want Congress to reserve the prerogative of making tariff law, and I think there are very specific cases where a tariff is warranted for specific industries that need protection over a specific period of time. But the problem that I have with the NAFTA and GATT agreement is that Congress abrogated its constitutional prerogative by turning it over to a World Trade Organization, and that's an issue of national sovereignty. I mean, I think that economic policy is part of what is the makeup of a sovereign nation. They have a right to protect, to a certain degree, the industry, and obviously, the downside of that is the cost of goods and services to a consumer. But nevertheless, those are questions. That's a whole science and an art that needs to be debated by our elected officials in Congress. And I support that. That sort of sets me with regard to the turnover of that. But as far as inflation goes, your argument is that the decoupling of the dollar from gold is what led to the huge inflation of the dollar. In other words, then you had Congress go, and the president, under the president's suggestion, go to the U.S. Treasury, which went to the Federal Reserve, and said, print up money. And so
that's right.
Yeah.
In essence, that's right. But coming back to the argument on that, with regards to the tariff laws, when you talk about tariffs, you have to understand that it does hurt the consumer, and that is one of the reasons why you've had a moderation of inflation in the United States, because what they've really done is inflate the currency, but then they've gone overseas to buy cheaper foreign goods to keep that inflation rate down. And Greenspan admitted as much in his book. So in a sense, you have a double thing working. But I would say one other thing, Chuck, that you touched on, and you are right, and I would agree with you, on the abrogation of sovereignty. But think of all the regulations that have been passed by bureaucracies that have been administrative law where Congress has abrogated its responsibility.
Oh, absolutely.
So this is just not an international thing. It's across the board.
No, you're quite right. I mean, it's not just a matter of Congress turning over its authority to regulate tariff and trade to the WTO, but they've turned that authority over to all of these unelected agencies that are spun off, that are quasi-public, and that are regulating business, and that's something that I would contend is unconstitutional, because only Congress, under the Constitution, has the power to make laws, not these unelected bureaucracies. And if they're going to make laws, they have to be under the direct auspices of Congress, and it has to be done publicly in the open, and there has to be a hearing on that, because I mean that's how the laws are supposed to be made. So as a result, we have this enormous web of quasi-public and private agencies and sub-agencies that constitute something like 3 to 4 million people, and that are costing the taxpayers trillions of dollars every year to maintain, and they are regulating businesses in such a way that are contracting the economy and are contracting economic opportunity here. So, I mean, I entirely agree with that. My guest is Harry Veryser. The book is It Didn't Have to Be This Way, Why Boom and Bust is Unnessasary, and How the Austrian School of Economics Breaks the Cycle. Harry, how does the suggestions from the Austrian School of Economics break this cycle of boom and bust?
Okay. Well, in my chapter on the Austrian theory of the trade cycle, which is really I think it's chapter 13 of the book, and it's really the guts of the whole Austrian theory, we argue that there's an Austrian multiplier, and that in order to, when you're at a situation where you've had the inflationary boom, you've created the malinvestments, the economy is now wounded. Now let me explain what I mean by wounded. 65% of your jobs are coming from small business. It is pretty much a known fact that the small business is the person, this businessman or woman creates the jobs. This is where they're going to be created. How does a small businessman finance that? Well, they finance it basically with their home equity loans. When I was in business, I had to sign over home equity. I had to sign over all kinds of savings accounts and whatever else in order to borrow money to finance my business. I had 65 employees. And what would happen is that I would sign this over and I would be able to finance it. Well, with this housing collapse, we lost $6 trillion. $6 trillion, that's almost half the GDP in home equity. So business is stalled now. It's wounded. It's unable to borrow. Banks are unwilling to lend money. They look at the balance sheets and they say, we can't justify making these loans. So at that point, you have a stall. Now, the Austrian prescription to that would be, how do we lower the break-even points of businessmen so that their balance sheets will look better so that they can go into banks and borrow? And there are now something like 80,000 pages of regulations and taxes, which is a 1.5 trillion, that's 10% of the economy, that's holding that back. So the concept is, if we could lower regulations for every dollar you cut out of cost of those regulations, every dollar you cut out of excess taxation, that means I, as a small businessman, do not have to go out and sell as much, so I can get to my break-even point far lower on my volume scale, which means at that point I can become profitable and start hiring more workers, start hiring more people, start investing in new businesses, start discovering new products. And that's what I would call the Austrian multiplier, which I think is far stronger than government spending. I mean, think of it.
So it's a combination then. It's a combination of reducing government regulation, except where it's really absolutely necessary, and getting rid of some of the, in a sense, letting business self-regulate with perhaps some government oversight, and at the same time taking steps on the part of the government to reduce its size so that the dollar can retain more of its value and will have less inflation.
That's right. Chuck, you've summed it up perfectly.
Okay.
You've summed it up perfectly. And so what we're looking at is, and this way you don't have to get into all kinds of layoffs and that. I mean, believe me, one of the hardest things to do in business is to lay off employees. I mean, I've had to go through that when I had my own business, and you don't want to do that because for even for selfish reasons. When you lay someone off, you're breaking up your internal division of labor and culture. You're losing a whole lot of internal knowledge that you may never recover. And so the last thing you want to do is cut there. Now, what I would say is that the Austrian school realizes that, and they say we have to keep the division of labor, the intricacies within these businesses intact as possible. So we have to switch cost cutting to another area besides laying off employees.
Harry, you're getting into an issue here that maybe is outside the purview of the Austrian school, and that is, at least based upon my observation, and I've heard some economists talk about this over the years, that there is a moral and ethical component to capitalism. And that is that, capitalism, the idea of completely unfettered capitalism is a false idea. That capitalism operates best in a society that has, and amongst people that maintain moral and ethical principles, which is to say that and the way that's practiced is that the majority of businesses and corporations and people, yes, of course they want to make money, which in itself is a moral idea, because if they're making money, it means other people are making money, and there's more capital accumulating in a civilization. But they also do not want to lay people off unless they have to. They're not this portrayal that the radical left has of business as being just in it for the money and that they enjoy, laying people off. I think that there is that, because that's the nature of human beings. We're all imperfect, and there are some bad people out there. But the real truth is that the majority of businesses and the majority of people do want to do good by other people. They want to exist in a community. They want to help their employees. They don't like laying people off. They want to make as much of a profit as possible, but they want to do it, they want to, do it in a socially responsible way. They don't need the government to force them to do these things. It's part of human nature. And again, that's recognizing the fact that there are bad people. That's also part of human nature.
Well, here's the major problem you've got. When you've got the Federal Reserve cranking out money, what it does is it makes credit available for people who are, say, at Wall Street, who are next to the credit markets. They can then go out and borrow money at the very low rates and buy up businesses like I had. Then they come into the business, generally having no idea of how that business operates. They come in with a group of people with laptops and whatever else, and then they start cutting, and they have no concept of what they're doing. And later they end up with generally a bankrupt mess, and a lot of people laid off. And this is all due to this credit system, because they're able to get credit where small businessmen like myself had to fight and practically mortgage body and soul to get credit. So the Federal Reserve, by doing this, is now concentrating wealth in fewer and fewer hands, and it's getting further and further away from individual people. I generally, in my book, I make the point that there is no such thing as a free enterprise or capitalist system. It's what happens when you do the right things. When you protect property, when you endorse the principle of subsidiarity, and that comes from Hayek and his idea of knowledge. I mean, Hayek said, why did the Soviet Union collapse? Because knowledge is best at the smallest and local level, the principle of subsidiarity.
It also comes from the Catholic Church. But that's,
yes.
And from the U.S. Constitution.
And from the U.S. Constitution. And those three things are in my book. I put those three things together. And I've seen it where these large companies, having access to capital, come in, buy up companies, lay people off, and create what generally tends to be a mess. And we've seen it happen again and again. And this is a result of this credit system by which you can create money without creating goods and services. And it's unnatural.
Right. Now that gets me to a more fundamental question here. Harry Veryser, the author of It Didn't Have to Be This Way, Why Boom and Bust is Unnecessary, and How the Austrian School of Economics Breaks the Cycle, available in all major bookstores. And that is, what about the Federal Reserve System? Do we need to have a central bank? If so, how should that bank exist and under what conditions? Because you talk about, and I think accurately, that the Federal Reserve and these enormous regulations, they're helping the big guys. They're helping the huge companies, the multinationals, because smaller companies can't compete with that. They can't keep up with the regulations. They can't get access to the same credit because the Federal Reserve doesn't lower the window to them, only to the big folks. So what do you recommend?
Well, I recommend what Hayek recommends. I think we have to go to competing currencies. I think that we should allow Americans to buy life insurance in Swiss francs or whatever currency they want. I think we should repeal the legal tender laws and let the currencies compete. Hayek makes the point in his book, and I agree with him, that we really can't trust politicians with the money supply. And a gold standard, one of the weaknesses of the gold standard is it would be political. The politicians would still have control over that part of the money supply, and you can't trust these guys because they'll break the gold standard whenever it becomes convenient for them. So I think competing currencies would work very well. I'll give you an example. Years ago, I had a cousin in Chicago, a fairly wealthy man, and in the 1950s and 1960s, he bought life insurance in Swiss francs so that, in a sense, he was protected against dollar depreciation. And I think now that's very difficult to do, but I think the more we open it up so that the average person can write contracts, write their pension agreements, write their bonds, whatever else, in competing currencies, that will act as a check on the politicians because it'll be outside their control. And so where a lot of Austrians want to go back to a gold standard, now I do think the currencies, under competing currencies, I do think you get gold currencies coming out, and I think that you'll have gold currencies, but you may have other instruments come in to facilitate savings and investment. But I would tend, and I think most of modern Austrians now are looking at Hayek's, what he calls denationalization of money, as a much better solution.
Well, first of all, I mean, would there not still have to be a national legal tender to pay debts?
Well, you would do it, but you could say you would have a national legal tender, but you would allow American citizens to use other currencies, or gold or silver, and you would allow them also to say write currencies and in Deutschmarks or euros or Swiss francs or whatever, and that would tend to act as a check on the politician.
Right, and I think that it was in 1933 that Franklin Roosevelt, as one of the first acts under the emergency, outlawed the right of American citizens to use gold as legal tender and to own gold other than for historic reasons. The maybe a problem that might come up from that would be what would stop the issuer of currency, whether it be Switzerland or whether it be American Express, which in a sense had a form of currency. What would stop them from inflating their own currency? I mean, how do we know that they have? I mean, this gets into the old problem of when money started to be issued by the big gold houses in Europe, and they would claim to have gold reserves in the vault, but then they would start issuing gold certificates and find that people
there wasn't any gold.
That's right. I mean, the people were using those certificates, and so they began to inflate those certificates, and you had these enormous merchant bank families develop out of that.
Well, here's a situation. A lot of the has to do with the interest rate. For example, what countries do now. Why, if you take a look at the European Common Market, why was it that all of these countries wanted the euro? Because of the fact that they could borrow money at cheap interest rates, because the euro was considered to be much more sound than the drachma or the franc or whatever else, the Spanish currency or the Italian lira. So by them going to the euro, what happened was it was able to lower the borrowing cost. Now, when you can do that in competing currencies, what's going to happen is the market is immediately going to go and say, okay, what do you want to do with your house mortgage? What do you want to borrow or what do you want to lend in? The interest rates on currencies that are stronger are going to be much lower. And eventually that will act as a check. Now, the problem in Europe is that the pressure now is on the European central banks is to bail these folks out. In other words, they use the euro as a method of lowering their borrowing cost. Then they overexpanded their currencies. They overexpanded their government spending. Now they're coming back and say, well, bail us out.
Right.
And so that's a problem when you deal with currencies. I mean, but the thing is, the average person would be able to protect themselves. They could buy a basket of currencies or whatever else in their life insurance policies or their pension funds or whatever else, and they'd be able to protect themselves. But on the other hand, the United States government would say, look, if we start printing money, what's going to happen is the value of the dollar is going to slip. The prices of imports are going to rise faster than domestic prices, and we're going to be stuck with a major political problem. So let's exercise some discipline here and keep the dollar within bounds.
Well, I mean, I would tend to agree with you with regard to competing currencies and the right of Americans to use foreign currencies. There's also a very interesting phenomenon, and it's one that's occurring right here in Massachusetts, where I am. Out in western Massachusetts, you've got several cities and towns who have created their own local currency, and that is the local transactions. There's nothing wrong with that. They actually have now put in ATM machines where people can get these Berkshires, they call them, in Berkshire County, Massachusetts. And there are stores and restaurants and banks and businesses that subscribe to the Berkshire for local transactions. It's interest-free, or there's a small fee paid to this company to get them. And they're able to, in a sense, use this as a currency, as a means of exchange, which is what currency is. But I've also had on an economist a while back who talked about the value of the national bank as it was first constructed in this country by Alexander Hamilton and by Biddle back in the early part of the 19th century, in that it was operating directly under the auspices of Congress. It had about 20% of its value involved foreign investment, but it was mostly owned by Congress, and that they would issue currency in public under the scrutiny of Congress as part of a public debate to build infrastructure and to do things that are desirable. I mean, they wouldn't spend it on welfare. They wouldn't spend it on, every program they would do would have to undergo public scrutiny because the results of the expenditures could cause inflation, and people would feel that immediately. So there was a lot of of observation. And during those years, there was a huge expansion in the American infrastructure due to some of these investments. Some of that same policy was brought back, actually, by Franklin Roosevelt in the New Deal, where government expenditures went to infrastructure. And it seems to me that that's not a bad idea.
Well, the biggest problem you're going to have is that if Congress controls it, and this would be my problem with it, is that, who guards the guards?
Right.
Who guards Congress? I don't know whether I trust this Congress.
Well, there's a difference, though, between Congress as it's constructed now, which is that they go to the Federal Reserve, which is a consortium of private bankers, and they say, lend us the money, give us an IOU, so that we don't have to raise taxes and we don't have to be judged. It'll future generations will worry about it. And then the Federal Reserve then moves a couple of computer notes. They create these bonds, and then they go to Wall Street and sell them to investors. And there's interest that has to be paid. In fact, I think the first or the second largest portion of the national debt is interest paid on these bonds that are sold by the Federal Reserve. So, but the difference was that the original national bank system was issuing the currency debt-free. They were not, or maybe there was occasional borrowing from bankers, but 80% of it was issued debt-free as instruments that were specifically targeted to pay for programs that would make money. They were not, it was very carefully done.
Sure. So, this is an argument of what's the so-called banking school, and what it says is that if you could issue currency, and you have productive projects, that this would work, that this whole thing would work. And one of the problems with it is that you are still going to pull resources out of the private economy. In other words, whether you tax to get the resources or whether you print to get the resources, there's going to be a pull of these things out of the private economy. And the question now is that as efficient as relying on the price system to do that? And the currency school, which is the Austrians, which I would represent, would say the problem with that is that you do lead to malinvestment. That, let's say they had done this with housing, and let's say they had put money into housing, you're going to raise the price of houses. What's going to happen is people, in order to buy those houses, are going to have to borrow more and more money. So you may set up another bubble. And the problem I think that you get into is wherever you have spending, you're going to have, and where you have excess spending where it's being pulled out of the private economy, you have the problem of bubbles. And the bubble sometimes is going to break. The biggest problem I have with federal spending is, versus allowing it in the private sector, is that let's say a private sector, you give it to the private sector, and it's a small business. Now, these businesses have a tendency to the strongest will survive. In other words, most small businesses, there's an element where small business is weighted out, but you're going to get the strong businesses survive. They're going to create new products. They're going to create new things that continue. The problem with federal spending and state spending is it's a one-shot deal. You go in, you build a highway, everybody has a job, and you pull resources, labor out of the private sector. But then when the spending's over, then it disappears. Where if you have continuing businesses that have discovered new products, new ways of doing things, new services, whatever else, they tend to continue in operation for some period of time. And I would argue that that's a stronger position.
Well, the only thing I would maybe throw into that conversation would be that if the government provides the funding to create a bridge or a highway, then we get a bridge or a highway. In other words, we have something that makes our lives better. Even if the jobs disappear, it creates more freedom. It creates more economic opportunities for cities and towns connected to the highway. It allows people to get from point A to point B, which stimulates more independence and more freedom, and all of that. For example, Eisenhower's National Highway Program, a classic Whig program, in my opinion. Going back to the days of the National Bank, funded by the government. It helped the economy. It helped everyone, even if the jobs disappeared when it was done. We now have a system where you can drive to California in half the time that you could have when you were taking small back roads. So, I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing, although I heard a very interesting comment by an economic expert a while back on this program, Andrew Gause, who said that you could have a private company issue its own currency to build a road or to build a bridge. They could issue the bridge currency that would be paid out to workers, and it could be recognized as legal tender locally, and then eventually those dollars could be paid back into the economy in exchange for other monies, and the entire project could be done debt-free.
Sure. Well, you could do it that way, or they could issue bonds. The problem is the state of Michigan and a number of other states back in the 1830s did exactly that, canals and railroad bonds and whatever else, and a lot of them ended up in bankruptcy.
Sure.
So it's a little bit difficult, and that's why I say it should be disciplined to a price system, disciplined to a market, so you're not building railroads or canals or highways to nowhere. I think that for example, the Ohio Turnpike was built by bonds. It wasn't built by printing money. The Pennsylvania Turnpike the same way, and then the bonds are retired by using the tolls. And they then used the money from that highway to build other roads in Ohio and Pennsylvania. So that kind of thing can work. I would argue I would prefer to do it by borrowing in the capital markets, because that way you're allocating capital efficiently, and rather than printing dollars, because we had a pretty bad experience with that in the 1830s and 40s with states. I think Michigan went bankrupt. Ohio, I know, went bankrupt doing that by issuing bonds or issuing currency in anticipation of those things. So that's a little bit more dangerous.
You have the Massachusetts model, which is the Massachusetts Turnpike was built by bonds, and when those bonds were paid off back in 1975, they decided to issue more bonds to keep the hack-infested agency going so they could continue to get money.
Sure. Well, politicians will do that all the time, but the situation is, especially if you have private businesses, there's a discipline of the balance sheet. They can't print money, and that's what I stressed. I told some of my students, I said, look, counties and townships are very much like private businesses because they have a certain limitation. They have a balance sheet. The federal government's much different because they can print the money to cover their deficit. But the county of whatever cannot do that, so they're disciplined. There's a certain discipline there. But politicians will tend to expand their scope of operations, and I think it's Parkinson's law. Income, expenditure rises to meet income, and they'll try to continue to get income to continue to push up expenditures.
Although when it comes to issues of banking and financial regulation, I tend to be a liberal in that I think that the government has a role there. I think that, for example, the Glass-Steagall Act separated, conventional banking with investment banking, and I think that was a protection of people's savings and investments, and it was done away with by some of the liberal economists during the Clinton administration, including Alan Greenspan himself. And the result contributed to, I think, the meltdown. The other issue that I think contributed to the meltdown of 2008 was the removal of previous regulation with regard to banks lending money to mortgage purchases. The banks were very conservative up until that point in that they had standards when they lent out money to mortgage purchases. They took a look at their background, their track record, their employment. They took a look at their investments. And the Federal Reserve came in and the federal government came in and said, we're going to get rid of those laws, and you can't even look at people's background. You have to issue them mortgages because we want to expand home ownership. And as a result, and I've interviewed bankers on this, both on and off the air, they weren't allowed to look at people's credit rating. They weren't allowed to look, and they started issuing mortgages to people who couldn't afford them. And there was, as a result, a huge meltdown, and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac then packaged and bundled those bad mortgages into these investments, which were sold on Wall Street. And when they went belly up, the whole system was corrupted, not just in this country, but all over the world.
Oh, all over the world. No, I agree with you on that. I mean, it's to have credit expansion, and one of the arguments I have with liberals is they always talk about, we need to have more regulation, except one regulation, and that's discipline over the money supply. So what I would say is if you have an undisciplined money supply and you have all the rest of these things in place, it's a devil's brew. It's a witch's brew that's gonna really cause enormous problems, and we've seen it happen. So I mean, to have repealed Glass-Steagall and then to have inflated the currency and allowed this credit to come in and have pushed this thing, really built up this bubble, which we have now seen the collapse of. I agree with you on that.
So I suppose the answer there is
sure.
hard. Thank you. Hard money, tight currency regulation. So the amount of currency in an economy generally reflects the amount of production, and perhaps a gold standard to help make the currency a little bit more conservative because it is pegged to a particular entity that's recognized all over the world as money that has a finite availability. Although I understand that the old Russia is buying up trillions of pounds of gold. I don't know what
well, what's happening is the Germans want to take their gold home too, and China's doing the same thing because they're very worried. The Germans especially are very worried because they've been through this twice, in 1923 and then 1947, 48. So that's why when Merkel goes into these conferences with the others, she knows if she goes home, she can't talk about inflation at all. So, and that's why Russia went through a tremendous inflation during the period of the 20s, and then went through another inflation during the transition to market economy. My biggest criticism of some of the people who guided the transition in Russia was the fact that there was no discipline in the currency. They just continued to print money. A lot of the people who got the money first were able to buy up the resources of the Russian economy at bargain basement prices and make millions of dollars because they had access to, or actually billions, they had access to credit that nobody else had. And it was because of this inflation.
Well, you present some very interesting ideas, and they're very much oriented toward the free market in terms of how currencies can be regulated, the natural checks and balances that would occur from competing currencies, in a certain way, a level of deregulation. One other regulation that I came across recently that I think hurts currency is that in 1938 or 36, around that time, Franklin Roosevelt set up the Federal Trade Commission, or the Securities and Exchange Commission. I'm sorry, the Federal Trade Commission actually went back to Wilson. But what they did was they passed laws that made it illegal, or made it only legal for municipalities to buy their pension plans and to do their transactions and their investments through Wall Street. In other words, Wall Street became the only legal bursar in the land, as opposed to letting states maintain their own bursars, where they could, where local municipalities could invest locally. The money could stay local, where it would help local businesses and local municipalities expand and get better rates. And by the way, the head of that agency, the first head, was Joseph P. Kennedy. Joseph
Kennedy, yes. Well, what's happened is that there has been a tendency, and it's a bad marriage between Wall Street and the government, where Wall Street has continued to cartelize the economy in that way. I wasn't aware of this regulation, Chuck, until you just mentioned it. But just having heard that the municipalities had to go through Wall Street, the Federal Reserve was set up basically to cartelize banking in New York. And wherever you have this anti-subsidiarity, if you want to say, or anti-10th Amendment or whatever else, wherever you have that, where people are forced to and you don't have competition, you have a cartel by law, you're inviting corruption. You're inviting problems.
And it also always is done under the guise of let's further regulate business. And the fact is that such regulations, people don't understand that they help the bigger businesses. They don't allow for businesses to function. If businesses were competing on the open market, which the bigger guys don't want to do because they've made their money, then you would have a more natural regulation of prices, of wages, because labor is also a commodity in the ultimate sense.
Sure.
And you wouldn't have this kind of bigness, which is really something that I think is artificial. I think it's something that is created by a kind of an unholy combination of business and government. When
I agree.
They go in business together. I mean, it's and there's an old-fashioned word for that, fascism.
Yes.
Anyway.
Well, I would agree with you on that, and I would even take it a step further. The interesting thing is an author by the name of John Jukes has made a study of innovation, and there's a new book come out. I hate selling other people's books. I should be selling my own. But this Anti-Fragility by Taleb. And what they're arguing is, and the argument is pretty valid, is that most of your innovation and new ideas come from small businessmen and small businesses. And what happens as you go up this corporate thing and as you expand into these monstrous organizations, you are actually depressing the economy from the standpoint of future economic growth because you're cutting off that whole period, that whole area of innovation and experimentation that you don't have in large corporations, but you have in small organizations and in people's garages and whatever else. So I think it has a double effect. I think the one effect is what you mentioned, is you have these large organizations that are cartelized and they're responsive to government. A small business does not have anywhere near the resources to pour into lobbying and influencing politicians or whatever else. That's the one side that you've mentioned. I think the other side is the depression, or the not depression, but the suppression of innovation and many new ideas that would come to the marketplace that are not ever going to come there because of that.
Well, Harry Veryser, I want to thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. How can people get your book?
Well, it's through my publisher is isi.org, isi.org. It's supposed to be available at Barnes & Noble stores, as I understand, and also on Amazon.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much, Harry, for joining me. Great talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck.
All right. We'll talk to you soon.
Hopefully,
thanks a lot.
Yes.
You bet. We shall
Okay.
return after these messages. You're listening to Chuck Morse Speaks. We'll be right back. Again, I want to thank Harry Veryser for joining me in the first segment of this program. He is the author of It Didn't Have to Be This Way, Why Boom and Bust is Unnecessary, and How the Austrian School of Economics Breaks the Cycle. Very interesting talk, I thought. I might as well take this quick opportunity here at the end of the program to mention my own books, which are available on Amazon Kindle now. I've discovered that I can publish books on Amazon Kindle. I've just published 3 books, all available for only $2.99. These are full-size books that you can read on your Kindle. The first one is The Monkey Trial, Evolutionary Politics in the Post-Traditional Age. The second is The Neo-Fabian, or the Counter-Fabians, Republicans in the Age of Obama. And now, just the last week, I have published On the Jewish Question, Karl Marx, Anti-Semitism, and the War Against the West. They are all available on Amazon Kindle. Just put my name into the server, Chuck Morse, and up they come. I am very excited about offering these to the public. I also have yet another book that will be online hopefully as soon as next week if I can finish doing the editing of this. This is another full-fledged book that's called Acorn, The Takeover of America. I use the organization Acorn as a metaphor for what I call the takeover of America, both literally and ideologically. And that will be available sometime next week, as soon as sometime next week, if time permits, with regard to the editing process. I heard my former co-host, Dr. Patrick O'Heffernan, who, by the way, is on following this program, the other day interviewing an economist, and before that he made a comment. He said, the old GOP is basically the party of labor exploitation. They're supporting the exploitation of labor. And this is one of those hot topics that probably both Patrick and I would agree we should not be delving into on the air because we're so different on this. But since I heard it, I'm going to comment briefly. First of all, the old GOP is not as old as the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is about 30 years older than the Republican Party. The first Democratic president in our modern times that constituted the Democratic Party was Andrew Jackson, and he was elected in 1828. And the first Republican president elected as head of the Republican Party was Abraham Lincoln, and he was elected in 1860. So the Democratic Party is actually much older than the Republican Party. With regard to the exploitation of labor, I'd like to see exactly how that term is defined. I don't in any way question the fact that labor is exploited. That I agree with. I mean, certainly it can be exploited either by private corporations, and when they do it, they're usually doing it illegally, or it could be exploited by left-wing progressive communist countries like the People's Republic of China or North Korea or Cuba or Vietnam, which I would contend absolutely exploit labor. But I would like to see, if it's a Marxist understanding of the exploitation of labor, Marx viewed all labor as a form of exploitation if it was in the hands of the private sector, because he believed that the entire edifice of private industry was what he called a false consciousness, and that there was a conspiracy on the part of those who created industry and business to exploit labor, and that this was a conscious conspiracy to get rich off the back of other people. I completely reject that. We don't have time to delve into that. I think it's obviously false. But having said that, I do believe there is such a thing as an exploitation of labor. The second point I would mention is, how does that connect to the old GOP? Is the Republican Party the party that is supported by companies that are exploiting labor? I'd like to hear a name of a company that is affiliated with the GOP that is exploiting labor. I'm not saying there aren't them. They don't exist. Maybe they do. But the more recent story I've heard in the news with regard to an American corporation that is involved in exploiting labor was the story of Steve Jobs' Apple exploiting labor in communist China. This was a story that was percolating for a while during the late Steve Jobs' lifetime. And Steve Jobs was openly and quite articulately identified himself as a liberal Democrat and was advising President Obama, also a liberal Democrat, on economic questions. So is there a connection between big Republican corporations and exploitation of labor, or Democrat companies and their connection to exploitation of labor, as would be the case with Apple, with Microsoft, Apple? I don't know. I think that companies who are involved in exploitation of labor to the degree they are connected to both political parties. It's not a partisan matter. Now, if one says as a matter of public policy that the Republicans are going to be opposing an increase in the minimum wage as an example of their, quote, exploiting labor, I think that that's a question that can be debated by reasonable people, because if there's going to be a raise in minimum wage, that's going to cause a contraction in the number of jobs that exist, because companies will not be able to afford to expand. And it could also be an inflationary policy, because there's going to have to be a lot more money pumped into the economy to support that, and that can hurt the value of the working man's dollar. So those are issues that can be debated in a dispassionate way with regard to what actually constitutes, to use the euphemism exploitation, but to use a more accurate term, economic value and economic opportunity. Anyway, I want to thank everyone for listening this afternoon. I shall return probably tomorrow. I may be off, definitely Monday at 1 p.m. You're listening to Chuck Moore Speaks. Check out my blog site at Chuck Moore Speaks. Have a good afternoon, everybody.